Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, had a text message, is our continuing series of Occult and Crochet, where we generally will talk about a little bit of something that I'm working on crochet-wise, and then we'll dive into a historical figure in the occult and or religious world. And something a little bit different since we're coming up onto the holidays. This is one of my designs. It's called a soap. I call it a soap sock, but other people call it like a soap sack, bag, whatever. But you put your bar of soap inside of it, and it's a loofah for your bar of soap. So I have those on my website linked in the description below, and I have an upcoming show in person in Salmon. If you're interested, you can swing by and check out some of the stuff. It's at the Stagecoach Inn, and there'll be, I believe, about 20 vendors that'll show up there, and it's different arts and crafts and food and all sorts of fun stuff. I just got back from one this last weekend, which was at the Elks Lodge in Salmon, and it was about 22, I believe, vendors. And there were people who had woodwork, baby stuff. There was a whole booth of just baby stuff. It was really cute. Other people who did some crocheting stuff, but then there was two different people who worked with glass. There was locally harvested honey. There were brownies and cookies and candies. One lady was actually doing some really cool, what do I want to call it? Natural health type lotion, cosmetic, cleaning or type stuff. So there's all sorts of stuff that shows up at these little events. And if you're not obviously around Salmon, you look around for your own in your own community. It's a really good way to support your local artists, support your local creators. And most of the time you can find some really unique gifts that other people may not think about. So something to consider as you're moving around. Now, on to our occult topic. And I would like to introduce you to a rather important man that you may never have heard of before. And I can honestly say that I hadn't heard of him before I started really diving into some more interesting aspects of the occult. We'll just call it that. And this gentleman is Henry Cornelius Agrippa. Well, why is he important? He just happened to have written one of the most important works that is, in my opinion, one of the most important supporting works. We'll start with that, because there's other works out there that are super important, but this one is kind of a amazing encyclopedia of information. So we'll dive into him and then discuss his work. Let's begin at the beginning. Best place to start usually, right? And Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim, and I will refer to him as Agrippa from here on out. It's a lot of name. Was born September of 1486 in Nettesheim near Cologne in Germany. His family was called middle nobility, and from what I could dig around and figure out what that actually meant, it means he would be upper middle class. Not like standard, but just a little bit above, like almost ready to step into the higher ranks, but not quite there. His family was in the service of the House of Habsburg, Habsburg. I double-checked the spelling twice, that's how it's spelled. For a while, probably where they gained their fortune and their position in reality. Agrippa went to the University of Cologne from the ages of 13 to 16, and a little young for university, but in that time, that was kind of what we would classify as high school equivalency, because you were considered 16 to 18, a full-grown adult practicing a whole bunch of stuff, and I could only imagine the horror of being operated on by an 18-year-old today. And he received a degree with the title of Magister Artium, I love these words, Basically, he had a master's of science, of what we would call it today. Agrippa discovered and became interested in the occult during his time at the university. I will have to say he's one of the younger people that I have found, outside of a very rare person, because there are a couple of other ones that I'll talk about later. But just in general, not being from a lineaged group, he's exceptionally young to be interested in this. And he followed a line of thought, which I didn't realize this until I was digging into him a little bit more, but he dived into the line of thought from Albertus Magnus, and claimed that Albertus's book Speculum was one of his first and favorite occult texts. And we'll talk about Albertus Magnus later, but he is kind of a semi-important figure. I won't say he's super important, but he did do a lot in his day to challenge a certain religious group's authority. But I digress. From this occult interest, he moved to Paris, France, where it is said that he took part in a secret society that practiced the occult. What is rather fascinating to me, as I've dug into him a little bit more, little side story here, I dug around a lot and I found little blips of his actual practice. It wasn't like he was very open about it. He didn't journal a lot about it. Most of what makes him so well known today is his compiled literature on the subject. It wasn't like some of these other ones who developed a lodge or was in a group that still held him in high regard because of his power, abilities, skills, fill in the blank. His actual personal practices were kept exceptionally secret, which is interesting considering what he published. But anyway, interesting though, Agrippa went to Spain to be a mercenary. Okay, you went to school for Masters of Science, you're into the occult, and your next thing is, I'm going to be a merc. Eventually he became the captain of the army of Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Not the Pope, so to speak, that he still hadn't consolidated all their power into one group yet. When Agrippa became captain, the emperor awarded Agrippa the title of Knight or Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R. Agrippa's military stint appeared to have only been around 2 years, although that's the common one I found through all the sources. There's another one that says his military career was about 15 years. There's another one that says 10, but the majority of the sources that I was digging up said 2. So 2 to 10, 15, something. He was in the military for a while. But the common belief is that it wasn't very long. In 1509, he was granted the patronage of Margaret of Austria, a governor, and Anton de Vergy, or Vergy, not sure how you would say that, Archbishop of Besancon, sorry. I had to get that word right. Anton was also the chancellor of the University of Dole. So with these two pretty prominent people for their time backing him, he was given the chance to lecture about Hebrew texts, one in particular which was, and I murder French, I'm sorry. And at the time, in that era specifically, weirdly enough, getting a patron meant that you really didn't have to, they'd pay your bills. You didn't have to work. They could help set you up in society, and that's what does you, because he had patrons. Today we have the website Patron that does basically the same thing. You just get other people to help fund your projects. In this time, it was generally 1 or 2 very wealthy people who would sponsor an artist, who would sponsor a musician, sponsor a, in this case, teacher. And there's still people who do it today. Not a lot. There are people in Hollywood who will sponsor starving artists, and they will put them up in flats. They will, pay for all their bills to get them on their feet so that they can survive and, pay it forward type thing. One in particular, sorry, but Johnny Depp actually did that, and for a couple of people over the years, up on their own. They don't want them being, oh, well, so-and-so sponsored him, so I have to. And in this situation, it's a little bit different. Their patronage was actually to lift Agrippa out of obscurity. But it still's going on today, just not in the way it used to, completely. But in this position, at this University of Dole, pardon me, Agrippa wrote a book titled On the Nobility and Excellence of the Feminine Sex. There's a French title, but we already tried that with other things, so I will spare your ears that torture. This was a work, in a lot of people's opinions, it was an attempt to prove the superiority of women in the use of Kabbalistic magic and ideas. It was pretty controversial for its time, since the Holy Kabbalah, believed in that time, and this carries through in a lot of circles even today, was to be used by men only. Some people think that Agrippa wrote this book to impress his patron, Margaret, which might be the case. You always want to make sure your patron's happy. For whatever reason he wrote the book, this was helping build his reputation at school. Eventually, though, he would receive a doctorate in theology for his lectures. So he impressed the big people at the school, which is pretty impressive considering he's virtually a nobody in most of these circles, like the academic theologic versions. And I apologize for the yawns. Long weekend, and so I'm a little sleep deprived. I lost my place. There we are. A lot happened in a very short time for Agrippa, though. Back to our story. As his star was rising at the school in 1510, he was accused of being a Judaizing heretic by the Franciscan prior Jean Catalinet, and this led Agrippa to leave this university the same year, because you don't want to be called a heretic of any form, especially in a school that's sponsored by the church. After Agrippa left the school, he returned to his home of Germany. There he would study with the humanist Johann Trithemius in Würzburg. I apologize to anyone who's listening from Germany. In April of that year, Agrippa was planning on dedicating his next book to Johann. The book was called On Occult Philosophy. Johann recommended that Agrippa not publish this work and keep his occult practices quiet like everyone else does. Obviously, Agrippa didn't listen or wouldn't be talking about him today. And that's not a joke. There were a lot of occultists roaming around in this time. There are today, and they don't talk about it for the same reasons. The few that do tend to be a bit more vocal about it, especially in this time. This was during the period of the Inquisition, so you didn't want to be too loud. Johann was warning him for good reason, because the church was starting to really flex its muscle, and people that did not toe the line had their necks stretched. And that's not a joke. That happened way more than we want to talk about today. And I will get into that later, but that is going to be one of those topics that's a lot more serious, just because of what happened during those times. Back to our story, sorry. Later that year, Agrippa went to the Netherlands and took up service with Maximilian again. From here, the king, Maximilian, sent Agrippa on a mission of diplomacy. His destination, England. Once he arrived, he was invited to be the guest of another humanist, John Collet, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's interesting how he keeps getting tied up with these particular guys. It was in England that Agrippa would respond to the accusations made against him by the Franciscan prior, the one that drove him away from the University of Dole, and he issued an argument that the Jewish Kabbalah was not incompatible with Christian faith. So the Jewish mysticism that actually came out of Babylon was not incompatible with the modern version of the time of Christianity, which was technically Catholic, but we won't go into all that. He continued that he could still be a Christian and appreciate the Jewish thought, the Jewish Kabbalah. Agrippa then, after issuing his rebuttal, returned to Cologne to engage in debates on this topic. The debates, and I found this fascinating, that there is a very strict structure for these type of debates. They were called disputations and were strictly monitored and have to be based on traditional written material and a very, this is their word, very thorough understanding of the topic at hand. Disputations are generally used in theological debate and scientific debate only. So basically, he was having to go to verbal war with this prior, saying, this is actually what I stand for, this is what I believe, but he had to be able to defend his position not just on opinion and I'm right. It had to be done through very strict traditional written materials, and he had to understand, not just on a whim say, well, it says this, so it has to mean that. No. So I thought, as I was reading, went down a wormhole on disputations, because they're still used today in a form, but during the time, this was very, very heated. It could get very aggressive for what they were doing, which, like I said, was kind of fun to read about. Agrippa went to Italy in 1511 with Maximilian. He did a lot in very short windows of time, so that also says that he didn't have to work like some of us have to, and he had this wealthy patron that would cover a lot of his expenses. Since Agrippa was a doctorate in theology, PhD theology basically, he was invited to attend the Council of Pisa in 1512. This council was the last council before the Protestant Reformation. That's why I'm saying this time was not a time when you would speak up that, oh, I practice anything other than Catholicism, without having a significant amount of hostility hurled your way. This was called to make peace between the Catholic rulers, the kings, the emperors, the queens, etc., and reinforce the authority of the Pope in the Church over all of these countries. We're working into the Dark Ages here, or just trying to peek out of them. There's a blur over during this time, but Dark Ages are occurring. Agrippa remained in Italy for 7 years, and during that time he was in service of William IX, the Marquis of Montferrat, and Charles III, Duke of Savoy. It is speculated that he was teaching theology and possibly practicing his medical knowledge, which was what he went to school for when he was 13 to 16. It was also during this time that Agrippa came into contact with other occultists and deepened his knowledge of the Holy Kabbalah. This led him to lecturing in 1515 at the University of Pavia on the topic of, Pomander of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. So he went into alchemy and, I just lost the word because I didn't write it down. Hermeticism. So he was definitely talking about some things that could have gotten him in a lot of trouble. But again, really wealthy and influential patrons, he could get away with more. The lectures were cut short, though, by the victory of Francis I of France. He stopped a lot of things that were progressing in ways he thought they weren't supposed to be. But in 1518, Agrippa's patrons were able to secure a position for him as town advocate, basically your county attorney, and speaker for Metz. Of course, his opinions and ideas brought him into conflict with the religious leaders of the area, mainly the monks. There was a monastery near there. As an advocate, as a lawyer, especially on the county roster, he was tasked with being a public defender. Not a big deal. Except for his biggest controversy, you might say, was he was tasked with being the public defender of a woman accused of witchcraft. During the Inquisition, that was a death sentence. Not really a question. If you were found guilty, you were dead. And they had a lot of inventive ways to do that. Not pleasant. And if I do ever do a video specifically on that type of information, I probably will do it on Odyssey, not so much YouTube, just because of the content might make YouTube very unhappy. It's a part of history that I think we need to remember, but it is an exceptionally unpleasant part of history. And most of your mainstream education is going to gloss over it. They're going to play it down, but the reality was exceptionally brutal and bloody. So, like I said, when I decide to actually, because I do plan to do this in the future, go over all these different time frames, that one in particular, I'm trying to decide how I would present that. So, something to look forward to. The defense brought him into conflict with direct conflict with the area's inquisitor. The inquisitor was not someone you wanted to be on the wrong side of. He could point his little finger at you and say, "Witch!" and your neck would be stretched, or you might be feeling really hot for a while. Depended on his mood of the day and how he thought he could chase the devil out of you. Anyway, eventually, Agrippa would resign from the office of advocate in or around 1520. The times are a little bit fuzzy there. Agrippa then practiced his medical skills at Geneva and Freiburg for a time. It wasn't there's periods of his life where they just kind of put footnotes in. This is what he did around these time periods. This was one of them. So between 1520 and 1524, it was assumed that he practiced medicine during those times, but no one's really for sure. He just kind of disappeared off the map. In 1524, Agrippa would move to Lyons and get appointed to Louise of Savoy. She was the mother of Francis I, King of France. But this position didn't hold his attention for too many years, only about 4. And in 1528, he had apparently trained a replacement and left. Agrippa was invited to a debate on the divorce of another ruler. He decided against that. I kind of poked around as to why they were picking him, and it was almost like they were trying to set him up, and I think he knew that, so he just chose to stay out of it. Instead, he accepted a position with the Emperor Charles V to be the archivist and historiographer to him, which means he was a glorified secretary and librarian. But a historiographer also is the person who kind of records what's going on up to that point and then kind of keeps track of everything. Kind of an important position, I mean, considering, because he who writes the history makes the history. Things were going quite well for Agrippa for a while. Then, as this happens with a lot of these guys, one of his patrons, Margaret, passed away in 1530. And without her exceptionally powerful backing and protection, his position in society was vastly weakened. So he did eventually publish some of his writings, but they were met with disdain by those who saw an opening to remove him from the public scene. This would lead to a short time being incarcerated in Brussels. The official claim was debt, but I personally wonder if it wasn't for some of his other opinions, beliefs, thoughts, and ideas. But that's, again, my opinion. The official story was dead. Just like other more controversial figures, Agrippa would fall in with a new patron, Herman of Wied, Archbishop of Cologne. This one's a little bit weird to me because you went from having patrons who are in the arts, sciences, and more metaphysical branches, and then all of a sudden your next patron happens to be the Archbishop of Cologne. He would attempt to fully publish his greatest work, his occult philosophy, in its completed form in 1533, and the Inquisition would turn on him again. But because his patron was an archbishop, they didn't really work too hard at it, because the Inquisition's arm was very long and very powerful. But Agrippa, to escape the nonsense of the Inquisition, went to France. Not outside the Inquisition's arm, but it was enough distance to kind of protect him a little bit. But he had opinions that weren't popular. Again, some more. And one of which was not great about the Queen Mother, Louise of Savoy. King Francis I heard about this and had him arrested. But he wasn't held for long, and he would eventually be released. I could not find with any clarity, so I won't talk about the gossip, why or what it was that had King Francis so mad. But whatever his opinion was, it angered Francis quite heavily. But apparently it didn't have any weight to it, because he literally wasn't held for more than, I think, 3 or 4 months, which in that time period was extremely short for you angered the king and you only got a slap on the wrist type thing. But so that's kind of his public persona. That's his public life, so to speak. Everything that was written about what he did, who he was involved with. So a little bit of personal information about Agrippa before we wrap things up. He was married 3 times, which blew my mind, because when I was going through a lot of this, he never really references a spouse. There are a couple of times that hint at a spouse, but most of his history doesn't talk about it. According to sources, though, he did have a very large family, so out of 3 marriages, apparently he had a pile of kids. Okay. He would eventually pass from this world in February of 1535. He was a very accomplished lawyer, or advocate, depending on how you want to say that. He was a physician, a theologian, a soldier. And the most important, at least to me and what we talk about here, he was an accomplished occultist, although very privately. Even though he went up against the church and the authority leaders of the time on topics of magic, the occult, and Kabbalah, going so far as to defend multiple people, against the charges of witchcraft, which were probably garbage arguments anyway, the Inquisition had some issues. Mainly to do with a little money on the side, and you could have anyone accused of witchcraft. Agrippa himself was not persecuted according to any record that I had found. That he was frowned upon, he was strongly disciplined verbally, but that was about it. He was called names. They did try to discredit him, but it wasn't outright persecution like they did to the witches, so to speak. He was known in a lot of circles that went against the accepted norms of religion and science for their time, and it was said that he was friends with and had some influence with the people who would actually kick off the fulfillment of the Protestant Revolution. That's huge. That started the weakening of the Catholic Church's hold over the known world. It pushed for the creation of a whole pile of new countries, and it started the fracturing of religion into the unbelievable branches of Christianity versus Catholicism, adding toss in Mormonism. It all started from this period. So him having that influence actually is pretty important. But I can almost guarantee you that when you look through the Protestant Revolution, he's not named. I've studied it in high school and I never heard this man's name. I didn't hear about him until I started digging into Kabbalah. That's when I found Agrippa. So there's a little bit more to history than you thought. Agrippa would not reject his occult studies. Not outright, not publicly, but he would issue a sort of retraction, but not really, of his greatest work. This gigantic tome right here. It is huge. Matter of fact, I'll tell you the page count in this particular version of it. This one does have some annotations, which makes it actually readable, because it's just a giant encyclopedia otherwise. Okay, let's get out of the index here. So it is 873 pages long. It is a volume. It makes the Golden Dawn book look small, and I'm not kidding. I should have had it down here. But comparatively, this thing is significantly larger. He said his studies were vanity and could be used for evil. I read the entire quote. I read it over 4 or 5 times, trying to understand what he was saying, and it was almost like he was mocking the people who wanted him to write this. It was interesting. A lot of things can be used for evil. It's in the heart of the user, whether good or evil lie in the practice of. It appears that to get the book in print, he may have had to add the denouncement so that the religious leaders would allow him to actually publish his work. I can't prove that, but in the wording of it, there's some implications that are there. He didn't really denounce anything. He kind of, oh, this is vanity. Yeah, you could use it for bad things. Yeah, shame on me. I shouldn't have maybe done that. But, it's the heart of the person that counts. And it was worded. A lot of people have said, see, he denounced everything that he did. A denouncement isn't a denouncement. A denouncement would have stopped the publication of this. He added it as a footnote in the 3rd part of this book, because there's 3 books in here. That's why it's so big. 3 books of occult philosophy. In the end of the 3rd book, that's when he puts the quote, but still publishes the work. Did he denounce it? Don't think so. This book has massive amounts of information. It's an encyclopedia. It has information on numerology, some star studies, probably pretty advanced for the time. There's herbal studies. There are sections on the planets in here. How the chapter 15, how we must find out, examine the virtues of things by way of similitude, meaning the law of similarities, of inclinations, of enmities. Again, they're all annotated, which is super nice because you have the little notes sections that tell you more about it. How by the nature of things, their virtues, we may draw forth and attract the influences and virtues of celestial bodies. In normal speak, how you can observe nature, see what plants, colors, and how they affect the world around them, and how you can use that to draw forth that metaphysical energy, which you can also use to an extent in healing in that respect, and also to attract the influences and virtues of the stars, the planets, the celestial bodies. Then he goes into the sorceries and their powers. There's a few little random spell tidbits in here, but the majority of this is telling you how to be an occultist. How the passions of the mind change the properties of the body by changing the accidents and moving the spirit. Mind over matter. Really big in the law of attraction people today, but he wrote about it in the 1500s. See, right there. Learning to quiet and control the mind. The virtue of proper names. Words have power. He emphasizes that multiple times through here. When you change a word's definition or you change the use of a word, you actually are working against its natural authority, therefore weakening your power. Not the word, yours. That's why when you say, not the word, not the energy itself, you. When you change the meaning of a word, and there's a lot of swear words out there, what we call swear words today, but the actual word itself doesn't mean what people think. And when you break it down, there's really no such thing as a swear word. There are curse words, which are placing a curse upon somebody, but the concept of swearing, please. But then he goes into, like this one, if you can see that. This is the numerology section of the number 6, the scale thereof. Then he gives the scale of numbers up to 7. And then Donald Tyson did an amazing job with his team annotating this book. The number 10 and the scales. And the scale is the powers. So what does 7 mean by itself? What does it mean when it's doubled? What does it mean when there's 3 of them? What does it mean through the layers? It's not just the number 7. Never is. Then he also adds a lot of the Kabbalah in here as well. So he's tying these to the Jewish lettering system. So you have a ton of that information. What I found interesting, chapter 15 in book 2, of the numbers which are above 12. So he kind of stops counting at 12 because 12 is a sacred number. Anything above that is multiples or combinations of the rest of the numbers. So that's why he stops at 12. I literally, the tables of the planets, their virtues, forms, what divine names, intelligences, and spirits are set over them, teaching you how to make sigils using magic squares, the different emblems for the planets, the spirits, the intelligences, the seals. Each one is different. The seal of Mars is calling in Mars's power. The intelligence of Mars is tapping into the knowledge from the planet, but the spirit is the essence. When you call upon the spirit, you're calling that planet to come to you, and that changes how you work with this type of energy significantly. Today we have our own version of it, but again, I really truthfully feel that if you don't have the groundwork placed, it can still be beneficial, but it's not going to be as powerful. And you also can play with some things you may not want to play with. So, and as you can tell, because I'm a nerd, I literally have been reading this book like a textbook for years. I'm at 369, so I've got a few pages to go. It is exceptionally dry because it was written to be a grimoire, a textbook, but it's fascinating to work through. Finding out the names of spirits, genius, and geniuses from the disposition of the bodies, because the bodies of the planets do affect us hugely. What are the ways the magician and the necromancers do, and think they can call forth the souls of the dead. Adorations and vows, careful what you promise and agree to. And then to the Reverend Father and Doctor of Divinity, Aurelius D. Can't say that. Austin Friar. Henry Cornelius Agrippa sendeth greetings. He writes letters. Multiple letters are in the back of this, just kind of giving you the... He kind of like annotates his own book at that point. And it's a fascinating read. If you are ever interested in digging deeper into the occult, if you're ever wanting to find out kind of the roots of numerology, because what we use today is nice, don't get me wrong, but when you start understanding that there's layers to all of that stuff, what we use today in most cases is, I won't say basic, but intermediate. He takes it to levels that are surprisingly intense. some of the sections are only like 2 little columns, but in those 2 columns, it's like getting a freaking massive mental download because there's a lot of information there. And I've used his book for references for different things that I've done, different practices, different meditation work. And I can say so far, I haven't found anything that has been less than honest with him. So, if you're interested, that's definitely something to look at, and I did link it in the description below. I use the term occult as secrets in talking about him because most of what he talked about at the time was extreme secret. And so the philosophy of secrets, the philosophy of the hidden world, it wasn't so much of a cult as you hear in the horror films of today. It was more of the secret. So it wasn't like evil, it was just something that wasn't talked about publicly. And a lot of his work in the metaphysical community today is fairly common, but his way of bringing it about is a little bit more scholarly, a little bit more intense. I will say, and I've put all this stuff in the description, the links are affiliate links, so if you click on them, it does help support the channel. There is a 4th book of occult philosophy. It appeared in the late 1500s. No, remember, Agrippa died in 1535. And it's attributed to Agrippa, but after reading it, the writing style is significantly different. I do have that book. I don't think I have it with me. I couldn't find it anyway. So, where was I? But yeah, the writing style is like in the 3 books, he is very scholarly, very matter of fact. This is how we work it. In the 4th book, which is more, how do I want to put this? More focused on rituals, not so much the bases, what you'd need to support them. The writing style is not the same, and other people have commented that as well. People with way more experience than myself. There is controversy over the origins of the work. They attribute it to Agrippa because of the time frame. I personally don't believe he actually wrote this text or had anything to do with it. I include it with the others down below as part of the lore of the occult philosophy, even if it's not directly his work, because it is kind of part of the lore at this point. So, before I turn this over to you guys for comments and thoughts, have you ever read or used this book for research, for actual work, for metaphysical practices? Had you ever, prior to this, actually ever heard of Henry Cornelius Agrippa, or the 3 books of occult philosophy? And if so, what were your thoughts? What'd you think about it? Because, like I said, it's a fascinating read. It's, like I said, very dry. But it's something that if you want to start wandering down, or you need some, or because this is where I'm at, I love to want to know more, then this is a great place to really dig into that further. He was a very fascinating person, very quiet with his occult practices, but his work speaks for itself. So if you get the chance, I highly recommend the book. It is a little pricey, so if you can find a used copy, that's great too, because I think the current hardcover edition of it is like 35 or 40 bucks, which for a text this size isn't that bad. I think I paid 50 for this one, but that was many moons ago. So there is a Kindle version as well if you don't want to tote around a tome. It's oddly enough not much cheaper than the hardcover, so there's that. But I think, let's double check my notes here. Oh yeah, I also stuck in the declaration on the nobility and preeminence of the female. So if you're interested in kind of seeing where that went, I didn't even know he wrote that book. I've heard about that before, so one I'm going to add to my list as well, because I'm kind of curious as to what his thoughts are there. But with that, I will let you guys go. Thank you for stopping by. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, drop them below. And if you have any thoughts or other people that you're interested in kind of hearing more about, let me know. I do have a ever-growing list of topics, so but I'm always looking for new stuff. I will talk to you guys later, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Have a great evening. Find a button.